Okay, so Gina, let's start our conversation. I'm so excited to be here today. Um, the first question that I want us to talk about and discuss is, what were your parents' hopes for your education, and how was your educational experience in school?
So that question always hits me some type of way because, having a PhD, people always expect that, my parents had real strong educational, not necessarily pressure, but like a cultural environment in my household. But that wasn't necessarily the case for me. They wanted me to do good in school, but it wasn't like a big thing. It was like, you just do what you can do. And I'm the first in my family to graduate from college, and my mother and her siblings was the first to graduate high school. So it wasn't like a big part of our family, I guess, dynamic where, I hear a lot of my colleagues are like, I'm a fourth generation college graduate. And so it was big in my household, but not necessarily critical to how they saw me and how they, raised me. So yeah, I was never pressured to do do well on, science projects or anything like that. But it was like, hey, you just do your best.
Yeah, I totally get it. I'm the same way. My parents, they graduated from, my mother got her GED, and my father did not graduate from high school. And I'm the first generation college graduate with my master's as well. So I totally get what you're saying. I totally get what you're saying. It wasn't like they were expecting us to do anything other than our best.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. Well, let's look at the other question. What is your educational and professional background, and why did you get interested in the work that you do?
Oh, that's a good question. Ooh. It starts I guess I would say prior to me even being born. My parents moved from Texas, a rural town in Texas, with the hopes and aspirations that they were moving to a more progressive space in California, and with this, dream of me having more opportunities, and them just kind of putting me in a school that's really diverse. Grew up in a military area where we had a diversity of students. We had Black students, we had Latinx students, Asians. We had a really diverse student body at all the schools that I went to in California. And growing up, although we had diverse students, we didn't really have a diverse curriculum or a diverse teaching body. So every teacher I had, my K through 12 experience was white, which is crazy because it was such a diverse student body. And I knew at an early age that I did not feel like I could be fully accepted. I know I introduced myself as Gina Tillis, but I was named after my grandmother, whose name is Virginia Santa Reina. And my dad felt like, it was important that I had a name that was palatable and easy to pronounce to non-Latinx people. And he was like, we're just going to go with Gina Renee.
And he's
African. Black. My dad is Black. He's from Gonzales, Texas, which is a tiny rural town outside of San Antonio. My mom, too, they were next door neighbors.
Oh, wow.
So cute. But even this notion of, hey, Gina, I'm going to prepare you for a world that is going to have to accept you, right? And you need to be accepted, starting with how you name yourself. You know what I'm saying? We're going to, whitewash your name. It's going to be Gina Renee.
Wow.
And so I live with my mom and my dad, but also with my grandmother, my mom's mom, who spoke Spanish. And that was her language, you know what I'm saying? I knew she knew English, but she was like, you know what? we didn't cross the border crossed us, okay? And so a lot of like my understanding of who I am came from my mom's mom, my dad, and my mother. My mother's, in our household, we spoke Spanish and we spoke English. And so at school, I would go to schools. My daddy's from the South. My mom, my dad speak like dirty South Ebonics. And my mother, she had like the Spanish, and my grandma only spoke Spanish. And so I would be in school and I'd be like, pues, they be tripping, que no? And I just never really felt like I could be myself in school. I couldn't talk my language. I wanted to speak like what I heard in my household, what I heard with my cousins, my friends. But when I would go to school, I felt like I had to perform and represent my way, myself, my ways of knowing and being in a way that I guess society identified as educated. And everything that I read in school, like the textbooks, different worksheets and stuff like that, I would read it and I'm like, I don't know anyone who talks like this. Who talks like this? The only person I knew who talked like that was kind of like my teachers, but like in reality, I didn't know anyone who spoke like that. And there's this constant like, I guess, duality or double consciousness, that I felt like I had to navigate because I didn't know anyone who was speaking what we call proper English. What's crazy is my last name is English too. So like to think like, you're supposed to be good at English. Your last name is English. And so to have that like in the back of my mind, like feeling like I could never be myself in class, feeling actually kind of bad about it. Like I remember my grandmother, she would walk to campus because we lived kind of close to the school. And she, like I said earlier, she is unapologetically, speaking Spanish, and if she's on campus, she's going to talk to someone in Spanish. And I would be like, I got to hurry up and meet my grandma before she starts talking to folks because I don't want people to know I speak Spanish.
So why?
Because,
and also, did that make you feel resentful? The fact that your father, you couldn't use the name that you actually was given, and then on top of that, because you could not, speak Spanish around the people, you couldn't be, like you said, authentic. So how did that make you feel, and why could you not be authentic at your school?
At the time period, you're like in second and third, and like you're young, you don't realize how like racism, manifests in our schools. And so you just know the Spanish-speaking students are treated differently. Yeah. And when I got to fourth grade, they put me in a dual language learning class. It was wild. I was so like, I could not believe it. I'm like, they found out. And the dual language learning class, it was like an English language immersion class. All of those students were not on the main campus. They were in the portals. And I just felt like, that is very telling. First off, I cried and I cried. I was like, I do not want to be. And I made my mom take me out of the class because I wanted to be on campus with the rest of the students, which is like so heartbreaking today because I think about just the role of language and our connection to each other. And like when I talk to like other like Mexicans or Latin Americans and I don't know Spanish, like I'd like to, I'm like, I wish I would have stayed in that class. I don't connect with the community as much. And that is so like, that's who I am. But to have this like culture that is constantly not even knowing, like you said, I'm in elementary. I don't even realize that, this is going on. I'm just like, I know these people are treated differently. We're treated differently. And so I didn't think about that until I got a little bit older. And like, when we think about like, just how racism manifests in schools, you think about language, we think about culture, we think about, just so many facets beyond, race and class and all these different things. But there's that intersect right there that really touched me because my last name is English and everybody would expect me to be like, oh, Gina, English, you're supposed to love English.
And did you tell us your degrees, what degrees you've accomplished?
No. So
Your
I did miss that. I definitely missed that. As much as I loved, I didn't like, so I loved English, not necessarily English. I loved learning. Okay.
Gotcha.
I hated English.
Gotcha.
Hated it with a passion.
Okay.
But I've always loved learning. And, when I got into 10th grade, I moved in with my grandmother in Texas. And when I was living with my grandmother, I befriended a lot of friends, like just throughout my life who, felt the same way I did. Like I, felt at time periods really alienated from school and felt like I wanted to learn but could never see myself in the curriculum and instruction. And so like my friends stopped going to school and I was like trying to figure out what was going on in society.
How many friends stopped going to school?
So many friends.
Because they felt alienated?
Yes. 2 ex-boyfriends. Cousins. I had like
So what did they do when they
cousins.
dropped out of school?
A lot of different things.
Okay.
Some things that,
Oh my gosh.
we don't probably want to tell.
Okay. All
But
right.
yeah, a lot of them
no.
end up, in the underground economy. We'll just say in the underground economy because they, had been told that, they're not college material.
Oh no.
And just felt like, school wasn't for them. And they were so brilliant to me. They were so brilliant, way smarter than I am with my whole PhD and everything. They could have had, multiple PhDs, but they just, were just tired of having to perform and play this game of education. So I started to notice like, hey, something isn't right here. And then also not just with our schools, but with just society in general. I had a whole cultural, what they call it, culture shock when I moved to Texas, where it's like literally I had never experienced, people live and like Black folks live on the other side of the tracks and there are roads not paved yet. And it just really inspired me to want to know more. So when I got in 10th grade, which I had already knew, like I kind of grew up knowing I wanted to have a transformative impact on society. I knew I wanted to be a teacher. And so, but when I got into 10th grade, I really knew for sure. I was like, I have to revolutionize history. We have to talk about what's going on because as I took history, but the history classes, I never really learned about like anything really relevant.
Oh, wow.
Are responsive.
Wow.
And so I was like, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to, become a history teacher.
Wow.
And so when I got to college, I had my mindset, I was going to revolutionize history. We're going to talk about past and present. We're going to figure out what is going on. And
you got a shocker when you got into the
Yes.
professional. Well, tell us let's fast forward. What happened?
So I got to college and I got my bachelor's in history and sociology, and then my master's in teaching social studies. And I studied, my master's thesis was on the aspirations of African American males in the rural South. So it's really about like, why aren't students continuing their education? Why aren't my Black male friends continuing their education? And then I moved to California, and I was like, okay, I'm ready to teach. And then when I got there, apparently, with my master's in teaching social studies, I still needed to get a credential.
Okay.
And they're like, well, you just got to go to school 2 more years. And I'm like, I have a master's. But I got a teaching position at a community college. And so I started teaching sociology. And that really kind of spurred my interest into just curriculum. And how that impacts how we see ourselves and how we see the world. And then, next thing, I was like, I want to teach at the collegiate level. And I got my PhD in cultural studies and education. And I'm not sure if I answered all your questions.
Yeah. Well, I know I met you when you were working at the University of Memphis, and we started working together when you were working at the University of Memphis. But your work in Texas was amazing.
Yes.
So your work in Texas so you worked at the University of Texas and you worked at the University of Memphis.
Yeah.
So tell us about those 2 programs, and then we're going to go into the next question briefly. Tell us about those.
Actually, I mainly worked at Houston Tillis University
Okay.
in Texas. I got my PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, but when I was working at Houston Tillis, I ran the Education as a Practice of Freedom project, which is, it's a year-long community-based learning project wherein our students are challenged to think about just the purpose, value, and meaning of education beyond credentialization. I think society is like, oh, we got to get these, certifications, credentializations, and like the way students relate to knowledge is a little different. It's a little different. It's like, oh, I got to hurry. Dr. Tillis, just tell me what I need to know to pass the test so I can get my credential. And so it comprised of a series of like reflections around what is knowledge, how does knowledge impact how we see the world, how we see ourselves, and how we go about living our lives, and what can we do with this precious knowledge to have a profound impact on others in our community. And so it was a community-based project wherein our students would, like, if they were majoring in computer science, they were doing projects around the digital divide and digital literacy. And if they were doing like majoring in education, they were doing projects around just literacy in general. Or if they were doing like anything with the natural sciences, we were just trying to find ways that we can use our knowledge to better serve others in our community. And that was a great experience.
Yeah. And then we're going to wrap up that question with your experience at the University of Memphis. And then I'm going to go into the next question.
Yeah. So when I got to the University of Memphis, I had the blessing of running supporting or collectively running a Grow Your Own program called River City Partnership. I don't know if you're familiar with Grow Your Own programs, but these are programs that are really a partnership between the university and the schools and the community to help support people, or just children, students from the community become teachers. So we want teachers from our community to become teachers because they understand the lived experiences of their students. And when they're engaged in classroom discussions with their students, they can make the curriculum a little bit more relevant because they know the experiences of their students. They know the communities that they come from.
Absolutely. So. I love it. Awesome. Oh my goodness. So good. Okay. So tell me about, and you touched on your grandmother, but tell me a little bit more about the one person who inspired you to do and I know this conversation is about desegregation and integration, who inspired you to do this work around integration, and how did school integration impact you and your family?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So my grandmother, Joyce Johnson, when I was younger, we would go to visit Gonzales, Texas, where my family's from.
And this is your grandmother on your
dad's side. My dad's side. So both my mom and my dad are literally next door neighbors. That's kind of weird. Everybody was like, oh my gosh, my mom and dad are literally next door neighbors. Wow. And they grew up together on this, in this rural town. But then within this rural town, there's this community called The Hill. Gotcha. And I'm from the bottom of the hill. Okay. Remember I told you earlier that, when I went to Texas, like literally the Black folks lived on, the other side of the tracks. But the hill is not even paved yet when I moved out there. Wow. Yeah. So my grandmother, when I would go out there, we would often go to community events that were held at Edwards High. Now, Edwards is a school that everyone in my family went to. So my great grandmother and my aunties and uncles helped establish this Black school.
Wow. On your father's side?
On my dad's side.
Okay.
In Gonzales, Texas.
Wow.
It's actually named after my great uncle. Wow. And it's Edwards High, and it's this, school that, was established during a time period where if you were even thinking about teaching Black students, you were at risk of your life. Ooh. So when people started establishing schools, schools would regularly, they would have threats against the teachers, threats against principals. Schools would get burnt down. But they helped establish a school that everyone went to in my family. I'm the first generation to not go. I feel really sad about that.
So the structure was still there. The original
Yes,
structure?
it's still there to this day.
Oh
It is
my
a
God. How
community
did
center.
it's a community. So how did they survive? What did they do? What did your father and your grandfather and what did
All
they
my
say that
family
they
members.
survived without it being burned down? Because I hear of stories that
Oh no, I don't.
they were burned.
I haven't heard any stories about Edwards in particular being burnt down, but I have heard stories about. I've read a book that had something around like someone's life being threatened in Gonzales that was teaching during the early 1800s, but. My story around that is my grandmother would tell me all these stories about like how, I would go visit my grandma. She'd be like, oh, that's cool. And it was started by your great. And so I would hear all these stories and she's like, I had the best teachers there. And like, they had so many community events at the school.
Wow.
Like even my generation after the school closed.
And it became a community center.
It became like, it was still it was
community
the heart
oriented
of the school. It's the heart of the community. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
What they call an anchor institution. Like we went to so many after school type programs, parties for the youth,
And it's still like that to this day.
It's still like that to this day. Yeah, it's such a beautiful,
gosh.
it's a historical site now, but my dad was the last one to go. And so, yeah,
Last generation.
Yes, I didn't get to experience that. But it was such a big part of the school. My grandma would tell me that, everybody knew the teachers. Everybody knew the teachers. Everybody knew not just the teachers and the principals, but the educators were revered in that community. And when the state came in, because they were, I believe they were forced to desegregate, and they didn't desegregate till way into like 1967. This is 13 years. After Brown versus Board of Education. Wow. And when they desegregated, they shut the school down. And my grandmother was working at the school. She was a registrar. She lost her job. Her cousin lost her job. A lot of the Black teachers were not hired there was like a tiny handful of Black teachers that were hired at the white school. But yeah, so it had a profound impact on our family. It had a profound impact on the school. The one thing that I think is still beautiful is that it's still there.
It's still there.
It's still,
it's a historical site now. Thankfully.
Yeah, but thankfully, like people were so like family members, community members were invested in making sure that it was still there for the community.
That's
and
awesome.
To this day, you can go get some free food on Martin Luther King. We have a little march. Juneteenth celebrations, different things for the community.
Good.
But
that's
yes,
really good.
That's pretty much like my family school desegregation story. Like everybody hears about like, Brown versus Board of Education. It's just like, so great.
I love it.
Gina, can I ask you, you mentioned that your grandmother used to tell you a lot of stories about the school. Is there a particular story that you remember that maybe stands out to you that you could tell now?
She just had a crush on one of her teachers. She said, everybody loved this teacher. But nothing in particular. Like, she just would talk about how important those educators were to the community. And she would tell me a little gossip here and there, but nothing like, beyond the fact that, school was such a big part of this community. It's this really like the heartbeat and this anchor institution.
What about your father, his experience there?
My dad had a great experience there. Okay. He said that, what he liked about the school is that he could go to the school and he didn't have to wear shoes. So, yeah, he said, I could run these streets with no pavement, with no shoes. That's how they grew up without shoes,
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. So, okay, well, keeping that same energy, what do you think people should know about desegregation?
It's a long struggle. I think, sometimes we think that Thurgood Marshall came in and 1954 and just, created, litigated this case and everything just was perfect afterwards. But, you know, we have been fighting for an education for a long time. I mean, literally, we have been risking life and limb to have an education. And then once we had an opportunity to have an education, we have been fighting for a more equitable education, more, you know, inclusive education. And so, if you think about all of the court cases starting in the 1800s, you know, people fighting for more equitable and inclusive education, scores of cases, scores and scores of cases. So it's not just Thurgood Marshall who came in, but really building off the shoulders of giants, you know, just working, building this case. And I think, it's important to share that narrative because people, ought to think, just one thing happened. And then next thing Black students could go to schools, any school, to white schools, and which is really interesting because you don't really hear the stories of white students going to Black schools. When we desegregated in Gonzales, Texas, the white students didn't go to Edwards. And Edwards had such an amazing education program, phenomenal teachers. You don't hear that story. You don't hear the story of all the educators who lost their jobs, their professions. You don't hear the story of the role that these institutions had in the Black community. Wow. And so when I think about, school desegregation, I always try to nuance that story because, it just profoundly impacted everyone in our community. And a lot of schools were shut down. A lot of teachers lost their jobs. And I'm also really interested in how could we have done this in a way that would have been more inclusive? What could we have provided? Because I talked about my experience. I so-called went to an integrated school, but every teacher I had was white. I had to go to college to have a Black or Mexican teacher. Wow. I went to a HBCU, but I had to go to a Black
And how
college.
was that experience?
It was profoundly different. I think I told
no,
you.
I'm saying as having a white teacher, what you told us, but going into that experience, give us your feelings when you were a student, how that
in
felt.
K through 12?
Yeah.
I just didn't feel like I was educated. Okay. I just always felt like I was crazy because I always loved learning. I was probably the most geekiest, nerdiest kid. I just love learning. I'm just always like that. My husband's like, you always got to look up something. Because I just love learning. And I believe and I know that everyone is just naturally curious about the world they live in. But for me to feel like in order to be educated, I had to sound like this, and I had to think like this. So I was just going to be deep. So I was like, I'm just going to be deep. And I don't have to be educated. I'll just be deep. And so it had a profound impact on how I felt about knowledge, how I felt about education. And like I said, it wasn't really until I got to college where I felt really in myself.
Gotcha. You could be
really
authentic.
Authentically. And I love that because when I teach today and I come to class and I have my, little accent and all that kind of stuff going on, and my students hear me and my stories, they're like, oh my gosh, Dr. Tillis, I love your class. You know why I love it? Because you be telling it like it really is.
I love it. So with that said, what would be your advice to teachers, parents, or administrators to realize the promise of integration?
So many different things, but I think, like I just said, education looks so differently for everyone. I think what you can do, is to be your most authentic self and create a space where people feel welcome to be them, where they can see their stories in the curriculum. So they see themselves in the curriculum. And today, I feel like it's so many issues around the curriculum and high stakes testing. And it just breaks my heart that, some of my students come to the university and they have this impression that, just knowledge is filling the bubbles. just tell me what I need to know to pass the exam so I can get the certification, so I can get this job. And it breaks my heart because knowledge is so liberating. The more you know, the better understanding you have of this world you live in and who you are within it. And I think, just, I think if we could reframe knowledge, if we can just reframe how we orient and understand knowledge and make it, it's reflective of just the power of, understanding this world we live in, and what we can do with this knowledge. We would have a big, what is the purpose of all this? Are we really living our lives so we can have jobs?
Yeah.
Are we living our lives so that we can make this world a better place for our children, our grandchildren, for generations to come? Right? I'm not in this game. I'm not in this to just make money. I'm trying to make a better world for everyone. And I think if we could reframe that and we can center our curriculum in that and create a way where everyone can see themselves, then we would be doing so good.
I love it. I love it. So, well, is there a defining moment from your work toward education equity? And I know that's huge because that's something that the Memphis 13 Foundation, that we're both on the board of, that we really emphasize equity in education. Is there a defining moment or memory that stands out the most? And then in closing, describe what freedom looks like for you and what that educational opportunity means to you. And you can kind of combine those two.
So in terms of moments, I've had so many moments, Sheri. I've had so many moments, but something that really struck like a chord with me when I was over the Education as a Practice of Freedom Project. And I was, we had this amazing community-based learning where everything we were learning was like, hey, how can we take this knowledge to better serve our community? And the process of doing that, my students had such great, reflective, reflections on who they are in relation to knowledge, as in service to the community. But as I was developing this curriculum, I thought about, hey, we are collectively engaged in supporting our community. How can we get the voices of the community in our curriculum? I think I mentioned earlier how when I was younger, I never really felt like I was learning anything relevant, right? I was always waiting for that time period in class where we're going to talk about something that I could actually, relate to. Talk to me about what's going on in my community. Tell me stories, connect this, And so, working with the Memphis Foundation, Memphis 13 Foundation has really challenged me to think about all the different ways that we can collectively
and developing curriculum for the Memphis 13 Foundation.
Yes. So how can we work with the community and get the stories of the community in our schools? So the Memphis 13 Foundation has really been instrumental in creating a space where we work with our schools, we work with members of the community, we come together, we develop lesson plans, make sure they fit the state standards. But we're that has been such a powerful experience for me in terms of defining moments. Awesome. And I love to continue these opportunities.
Right. And then, of course, describing what freedom looks like for you in closing and what educational opportunity means to you and your family.
Okay, so what freedom looks like to me is also a really loaded question. But I think I kind of really spoke to that earlier. It's just creating, redefining education. I think each time we speak, I always tell my students, each time we speak, we teach. Each time we listen, we learn. So I don't have to be in front of this classroom and you see me as the only, conveyor of knowledge. We're all in here learning together and just trying to find ways to push the boundaries on what we define as education and realize that we're always learning. We're always learning as long as we're willing to listen. as long as we're willing to share our stories, we can teach others, and we're in this together. So this like understanding, like reframing how we understand knowledge, I think it's liberatory. We understand that knowledge is it's profound impact on how we see the world and how we see ourselves and how we navigate these, the society that we live in.
Yes.
And so, yeah, that is like, to me, ultimate number one goal. And I wish we'd have more spaces in schools to have these conversations. And I think us as like people, I would say educators, but like trying to find spaces to have these conversations. I know it's very difficult with like strict, high stakes testing and standards, but having those conversations, reflective conversations with each other and different spaces and intergenerational conversations. And, I just think that's critical.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to say?
I can't think of anything at the moment, but I've really enjoyed this.
Me too.
Yeah, I've been wanting to talk about, just my relationship with education. So thank you.
Yes. Well, you need to write a book, and it could say, My Relationship with Education.
Yeah, I'm grateful. And I'm just blessed to be in a space where I can continue to have these conversations and talk to teachers about them, talk to educational leaders. And so thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I have a few follow-up. This is
Okay.
This has been absolutely lovely. I'm curious, Gina, when this is obviously a huge part of your philosophy now, but when did you first view education as freedom?
I think, when I was in high school and I moved to Texas and I had that culture shock, and I was like, wow, this really transformed how I perceive society. So if you've been exposed to just one lens, right? And then you're exposed to another lens, and it changes how you see the world and how you see yourself. Then at that time period, I was like, wow, I wonder how many other lenses, I wonder how many other perspectives, other ways of knowing and being. That really challenged me to think about, wow, just this, it was a physical experience moving, but it was also an educational experience. So at that time period, I was like, I'm on a quest to learn and revolutionize history. So yeah, I don't know if there was like a necessarily a more defining moment than me just having an opportunity to step out of, I wouldn't say like a comfort zone, but what I knew, to step out of what I knew and to experience something different. And I think that you can do that through a book. You can do that through StoryCorps, a documentary, whatever it is. Those perspectives impact how you see yourself. See, I'm telling you right now that I'm like, I think I mentioned that I'm Black and I'm Mexican and I'm Choctaw, but I'm thinking I'm Black and I'm Mexican, I'm Choctaw because somebody told my grandmother that she was Black. My grandmother's Black and Choctaw. But, during that time period, if you had that one job, then you were Black. And so that is impacting how I see myself.
But she was light complexion like you.
Yes. But that just someone telling her, right, that she is Black impacts how she sees herself.
Yeah.
So words are powerful.
Yeah.
Words are powerful. And anytime you come across any medium of information, whether that's word or image or whatever, that impacts how you see the world and how you see yourself. For me to go around navigating this world like, oh, I'm like, you filled out the little bubble. I'm Black, I'm Mexican, I'm Choctaw. Like that impacts how I see society and how I see myself. And I don't know.
Well, now you said your grandmother that spoke Spanish. Now, whose side was
That's my mom's mom.
Oh, so Spanish, Choctaw. So
My
who?
mom is Mexican, and her mother spoke Spanish, and she spoke Spanish.
Oh,
I
your
didn't tell you.
mom is
Yes.
Mexican
Yes.
and Choctaw.
No,
and
my mom is Mexican, and my dad is black and Choctaw.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And so, and my mother had a really interesting relationship with speaking Spanish in schools in Texas. I don't know if you're familiar with the type of violence that Spanish speakers experience growing up in the 50s and 60s. Like, I had this one professor mentor, she's Mexican, she grew up in Arizona. She said that to this day, because she had so many smackings for speaking Spanish, when she speaks Spanish, she stutters. When she speaks English, she speaks perfectly fine.
Trauma,
So the trauma of and the crazy thing is that, my parents hoped that my generation would have this more equitable and inclusive education. And they sacrificed so much, you think about all the people who, lost their professions, all the educators, the beacon, the anchors of their institutions with the hopes that they would one day have more inclusive and equitable schools. But our schools today,
are
they're
just
certainly not.
Yeah.
Certainly not. And
They're more desegregated.
More segregated.
I mean, segregated. They're
more inequitable.
Yeah, more inequitable than they were in the 60s.
Yeah.
You've mentioned some of this, but can you say a little bit more or describe just some of these differences that you experienced when you moved from California to Texas?
Yeah. So I moved from California in a very metropolitan area where all the streets were paved. And then I moved to Texas. I had been going back and forth just a little bit. I didn't really realize, I didn't understand the rural, small country town social structure. And in these small rural towns, there's not too many opportunities. I think a lot of the attention is on the urban, urban institutions and urban education. But in these small rural towns, my grandma would be I would tell her, I'm going to come back and I'm going to teach over here. I'm going to show them. My grandma said to me, you'll be out your mind to come back to this small rural town. Why would anyone who graduated college want to come back to this? But, in these small rural towns, there's this I guess I would call I hate to use the name brain drain, but if you go out to college, you're more likely to move to an urban center where you can find work in your profession. So when I moved to this rural town and I come to in consciousness of systemic oppression, and I literally see that Black folks live on the other side of the tracks in unpaved community. In an unpaved community, literally, it's 1996, and the streets are rock and dirt. And you go to the other side of the tracks and you see the plantation houses, really big houses. And, there's not too many places to work in these rural towns. And so, my friends who start dropping out of school, they had learned from their teachers that they weren't college material. So you're not college material, what you going to do? You can work at Walmart, because it's not too many. You can work at Walmart, you can work at, the Piggly Wiggly. Grocery store, ain't too many places you can work in these rural towns. So it's what is the point? What is the point of graduating? And it's heartbreaking because I knew there was so much smarter than I was. And it just hurt me to my soul to see so many of my friends and my cousins say that they were not going to, they're not going to deal with this anymore. Then I think about the opportunities that are open to young Black men who don't have a college education.
How did these friends respond when you said you wanted to be a teacher?
They was
Sorry, Gina, I was going to say, if you could just direct these
oh, yeah.
to Sheri and
I'm sorry.
I think a lot of them knew it. They were always Gina, you're so deep. You just, And so a lot of them kind of felt just like they knew I was going to be a teacher.
Yeah.
They knew I was going to have, and they was very excited.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is that I am known in my community as the, what do you call it? The college whisperer. Like everybody came to me to like for like advice on how to get to college. Can you help me with my essay? Can you help me with financial aid? Like, and like I'm the first in my family to go to college, but I like helped so many others go through the process of being admitted to college. When I was in high school, I had no idea of how to get to college.
Oh.
I just knew I wanted to go there. So even like figuring out what the process is around like financial aid or how to get admitted, that's daunting for families who don't have anyone to help and guide them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm like the college whisperer.
No, I totally get it because I was the same way. I didn't have anybody to help me either. So I totally get it. And I went to college later in life and finished. And but yeah.
But it's such a blessing to be able to help so many people.
Yeah.
My siblings, my cousins, my friends who like, and you know, I love college. I didn't really care for my K through 12, but I love. And I would always tell them like, it's okay that you don't like high school because college is so much different. You get to learn what you want to learn and take the teachers you want to teach. And that really inspired so many of my friends to go on to college. And yeah.
Oh, wow.
Which I suspect maybe it was college, but when is the first time you talk about feeling you couldn't be yourself in your K-12 education? When is the first time you felt free in a classroom or a school?
When I went to college. When I went to college, I had the blessing of having some amazing professors at Grambling State University.
And HBCU.
In HBCU in Louisiana. And, you know, like these professors that they are everything I can imagine that my dad and grandparents and aunties and uncles had when they went to Edwards. That we don't really see that, like, you know, that much. Just like, you know, you don't really need too much to be an amazing teacher and to have a good education. And I had such phenomenal professor mentors that really saw me and, you know, saw me beyond the student to, you know, all my dreams and aspirations. And they would talk to me and they'd be like, Gina, you need to, you know, they would give me certain books to read and, you know, encourage me to take certain classes and, you know, be
Which
a part
changed the trajectory of your life.
It did. And so just all of that together was instrumental in my growth and just like their pedagogy and how they engage is really like what I aspire to teach, like to be my most authentic self and see like when I got to college, I got to see professors who were like me, but in so many different ways. It really inspired me. And I'm like, hey, you know, a good teacher means the world. It means the world.
Yeah, we've arrived though. I mean, HBCUs are historically Black colleges and universities, but they are open to all races.
Always have always.
Yeah,
have
and
always.
I know you talked about how white people didn't go to, you know, Black schools, but they actually do go to HBCUs today, and HBCUs are welcoming of all, you know,
Always
multicultural.
have always been very welcome too. Yeah.
So that's
and
a great
inclusive.
thing.
Yes.
Yeah, inclusive.
And the pedagogy is on point. And so,
Yeah.
Gina, just like one or two more, and then we'll wrap up. I want to make sure we're staying on time. But, can you describe to Sheri what Edwards High School looks like, what it feels like to walk down those halls? I know you weren't there when it was an active school, but I'm sure.
How big is it?
Okay, so
How many square feet?
right now, there were more buildings than are currently up today. But so there's this beautiful gym where we have all of our community events. I remember when I was a girl, we would have little dances for the kids.
Yeah.
We host our Martin Luther King celebrations in there, Juneteenth.
Yeah.
We do a little, my uncle, he's really involved in the community center. He does a little Christmas gift giveaway. Right outside of the gym, there's 2 buildings. One is a 2-room type classroom type of vibe where when you walk in, there's this foyer area, and then to your right, there's a classroom. There's a kitchen little area.
Aww.
Then there's another classroom on your left. So it's this little 2 classroom type of vibe.
Oh, wow.
My cousin got married there. We had our little afternoon, like the little reception and stuff like that. And that is like we host things there. We host a lot of things. Right now, it's actually in the last year, it became a museum. So
it's basically a 2-room school.
2-room
classroom schoolhouse.
Wow. They had other classrooms, but they eventually shut those down.
Okay, gotcha.
But those were like after, I think that's the original structure, the 2-room.
Okay.
Then there's another building, and that one is closed. There's nothing in that. That one needs to be renovated.
Gotcha.
If you have any money and you want to donate. But yeah, if you go to Edwards today, it's still there. You probably need
Is there a website for the school?
You know what? There's may not be a website.
Oh, okay. Or community
but if you
center.
can, you can type in Edwards High, Gonzales, Texas, and
Edwards High,
learn
Gonzales,
about some of the community events. I know for sure you got a Facebook.
Okay.
I don't know if we got a website, but yeah, I love that my family is so involved. That my cousin got married there, and it's just such a big, like I said, it's the heart of the Hill, where my family from, the Hill, in Gonzales, Texas.
Yeah, it's awesome.
How are we doing on time? One more, okay. So you touched on this earlier, but Edwards is obviously this beautiful heart of the Hill, as you're saying. So other than job loss, which is huge, what else was lost with the segregation?
I think the thing that hurts me the most was our connection to education, the alienation that I felt as someone who, didn't see myself in the curriculum and instruction, our connection to education. Like I said, education in the Black community prior to Brown v. Board of Education. It's this anchor institution. Yeah. Everyone revered these teachers and these principals. And they would get up in your face, Miss Gina did not turn in her assignment. They would talk to your parents during church and everything.
So the community orientation.
It was this relationship between the school and the community. And not just this relationship between the school and the community, but the student and the educator to education.
Yeah.
I felt like this connection to education, how we see education, how we understand the value, purpose, and meaning of education
was lost.
It was always about freedom for us. Yeah. Always about freedom.
Education was always about freedom.
These schools birthed the civil rights movement. And so back to your question, I feel like there's the connection that hurts me the most to education, this relationship between the schools and the community, but how our students feel and connect to what they're learning. Hurts me the most. Well, like I said, I get my students coming to college and like, Dr. Tillis, just tell me what I need to know to pass the test so I can get my credentials, so I can get my job.
So you don't feel we shouldn't have not integrated the schools?
Oh, no.
You just feel that it should have been done in a different way
that was inclusive. That was inclusive.
Yeah.
And I think anyone should have the opportunity to go to whatever school they want to.
When you say inclusive, you mean the same books?
Oh,
the
not
same funding, the
yes,
same
all of that,
equity.
all of
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
To feel the same
Yeah.
way that any other child, like no one should have to go to school and feel like they had to silence their voice.
Same type of curriculum, same type of sports,
Yeah,
the
that
same
we
type
want
of
them to
arts
have the same type of
programs,
resources,
type
the
of resources.
technology, the
Yeah,
everything, the
technology,
infrastructure,
the infrastructure,
the connection,
the connection,
the
connection,
teachers,
the
all
teachers.
that.
Yeah,
Like I said
yeah.
earlier, you don't hear the stories of, white students going to black schools.
Yeah, yeah.
Why was that?
Yeah.
So we really just transferred to white schools. We didn't desegregate.
Yeah.
We transferred to white schools. And I think we could have done a better job at that. And I'm not I think that's the main thing. I think everyone should have access to a liberating education.